Welcome back to Queerly Yours on XLR Land University Radio. I'm your host, Abram Thrasher, and today I'm either going to trans your gender or make you very confused. You get to decide. Today we're going to talk about queer voices, and I will get to be a little bit of a linguistics nerd. I will get to just do my horrible little thing. But right now we're mostly talking about media and media casting. And that means in the context of voice work, in the context of some acting, but mostly voice work, because this is a special endorsed episode. The reason I can talk about this is, one, because I'm trans, and two, because I've talked about this a little bit, but for medical reasons and stuff, I'm not transitioning in the traditional way, so I can do a lot of things with my voice that cis people can't. I can pitch it up, I can pitch it down, I have general range, and for me, it's because I had pertussis when I was a kid, and that really damages, just your everything. And in this episode, I'm gonna say something that's gonna make people a little bit cranky. Trans people can do things that cis people can't, with our voices, and that's important in the context of this episode. In the last few years, there's been this rise in casting queer people in queer people roles, in casting, in writing, queer roles into shows, especially kid shows, and animation, but also writing them into adult shows, and not just for the one-off episode, or for the character that dies, 3 episodes in, but actual genuine roles. And there's been a discussion in the last, I'd say decade or so, of, people talking about whether or not it matters if someone who takes a queer character role is actually queer. And it's in the broader discussion of representation in general. Who gets to play a role? Who gets to be this person on screen? Who gets to be this person for people who see this character? And this is especially important in visual aspects. If you cast someone as an Ashkenazi woman, she better be an Ashkenazi woman. If you cast someone, if the character is a person of color, that better be a person of color, and not just any person of color, but someone of that race. That's very important. And in the context of queer stuff, people think it gets a little bit muddy. I don't. You shouldn't be casting, cis people as trans people. There's a whole layer of mess there. I've talked about this before in previous episodes and previous, broadcasts. But when you cast someone cis as trans, it says something to the audience. Mainly, it says that you think that trans people are parading around in a costume. Especially if you cast cis women to play trans men, or cis men to play trans women, or just anyone off the street to play someone who's non-binary, and you don't cast specifically for those roles. You're saying that people just parade around in costumes. And that's not what, queerness is. And this is very personal to me, because I live very large parts of my life as a performance. Not just here, not just professionally, but just in other, unmentionable parts of my life. This is this is my industry, this is my job. So it's very important to me for this broadcast, but also going forward into the rest of my life, that this is something I talk about, something I advocate for, and this is something I want people to know. You can't just cast people for whatever. It's very important that when you make a point to make people represented on screen, when you make stories, when you write trans stories, when you write queer stories, it is very important that those stories are told by people they're written for. They're told by the people that they're made for. They're told, and they're enhanced when they're told by the people they are about. Back to trans voices. While there is no trans cadence, and there is no gay cadence, there's no trans accent, there's no gay accent, there's no non-binary specific term of voice, there is a very specific way that queer people sound that you cannot replicate when you're straight. It's an emotional thing. There is no trans, gay, non-binary accent. And the idea that they are comes back to a lot of very old stereotyping. I'm going to go back and talk about the lavender scare for a minute. The lavender scare, for those of you who haven't tuned in before, is this thing that ran parallel to McCarthyism, where gay people were targeted by their peers, being outed could ruin your life, ruin your job, and the general stereotype, in the 50s and 60s is that gay people were all, pedophilic sex mongers. And that only got worse when things progressed during the 80s and 90s with the AIDS epidemic. But during this time, during the Lavender Scare, they did these old PSAs. I don't know if you ever had to watch them, in your history classes and social studies. You may have only had to watch them in your AP classes. They did these, these PSAs, these commercials. And in these commercials, they had gay men talk in a very specific way. It's very, feminine, valley girlish, like, bye, Felicia, hey, very feminine, very, forced falsetto. That's not something I can personally do with the exaggerated hand movements and such. And that's the image that America had of gay people for a very long time. That's the stereotype of gay men, even now, in shows that are released up to 5 years ago. Very feminine voice, very feminine cadence, very, exaggerated falsetto and heavy hand movements, because that's the way gay men were projected to America. So that's the image they have. There is the culture of camp. There is the culture of embracing femininity and femme and a lot of other things in gay culture that, contribute to this accent, but not in the exaggerated way that straight people see it. And there is a history of vocal stereotyping, too, with trans people. And this is partially because of the way transitioning works with your voice, which is something I'll cover in a bit. But there is no specific trans voice, but there is something people project as a trans voice, especially when they're asked to sound trans. And if you're playing a trans woman, you are very specifically, in a lot of those older, cartoons and a lot of such, where you would have the big butch woman, and she'd have, just the square shoulders and the butt chin, and she would just have, this gravelly voice. Or, if you're talking about the Lobster and the Powerpuff Girls, this very forced, very clearly a man forcing a falsetto. And just this very pinched, nasally sound. And you can see it just portrayed in conservative comics, the way they just draw the lines on trans people's faces. So when you ask someone who's cis to voice someone who's trans, what voice are they going to fall back on? What voice are they going to have automatically in the back of their heads? From childhood, from history, from references that are easily available? What are they going to hear back in their own ears? It's something very important to think of when you're interacting with media. This is my attempt at a stereotyped trans voice. I identify as, an attack helicopter. Huh, that sucked. Ow, I apologize. Yeah, I'm glad none of you, this isn't a visual medium, because then you would have had to seen the grotesque way I had to twist my face in order to make that noise. So, I said it before, I will repeat it again, trans voices can do things that cis voices cannot do. And I made this very seriously. Trans voices have a better range, especially trans women, because you have to do a lot of voice training if you're a trans woman, because unfortunately estrogen doesn't work the same way as testosterone. Here's a little bit of how hormones work. Hormones open up, the larynx, and trans men, they make the voice drop the same way they do for prepubescent boys. They relax the muscles there, they make stuff bigger, and they make it stretch. Testosterone is the hormone that affects your voice when you're growing out those secondary sex characteristics as a kid. So estrogen doesn't really change your voice much. As a trans woman, it shifts it a little bit, but because it changes your fat distribution and stuff, not necessarily because it changes any structures on the inside. So trans women do a lot of voice training and do a lot of, practice in order to get that high feminized voice that's expected of them. And I am never going to hormonally transition, partially because of health problems, and partially because every other person in my family has gone bald, and I am very vain. I prefer having hair, and I am too fat for anything else to matter to me. So because of my previous health history, and because of, the damage, I did a lot of voice training growing up, partially to just get my voice back. I did have to do a lot of voice therapy, but also because I liked the way I sounded when I was really sick, in the times when I had those respiratory infections and when I had pertussis, so I replicated it, and I kept driving myself deeper and deeper, and so this is a very practiced voice for me, just like it is for a lot of trans people who don't fully, transition in the medical sense that's expected of you by insurance companies. So I can talk like this, I can talk in the way you understand, like you hear me and you're used to,
and I can also talk like this, and I can talk really high in like this falsetto voice that's expected of you in customer service, and apparently when I talk in this voice, I also have to turn up the gain on the motherboard because you cannot hear me. And I can talk like in this Winona Ryder, like this middle tone, like this very 80s smokes such. And when I talk like this, you can hear the voice damage in the back of my throat that allows me to have this range. And I can talk, I can go deeper, I can go below, but it hurts. This hurts my throat a little bit, and also it makes me incomprehensible. So I settle in this, low tenor range. This is something that has surprised people who have been around me. And that's because this isn't something that a lot of cis people can do. This range is very impressive to you for some reason. The reason I bring this up is because this difference, it shows, in my voice, not in the way that, trans people can never pass because of their voices. I've heard that before from people, by the way. It's blatantly untrue. Many of you have heard trans voices and you have never picked up on it. And I guarantee you that, because there are a lot of trans voices in voice acting. The reason I bring this up isn't because of that, it's because this is a thing trans voices can do that cis people cannot. So when you ask a cis person to play a trans person, you're asking them to have a skill that most cis people just don't have. And so you're asking them to have a cadence that most cis people just cannot replicate. Let's talk about trans voice actors for a moment, because I realize I contradicted myself a moment ago. There is no trans cadence, however. There's no trans accent. There's no very specific trans sound. However, there are things trans people can do when voice acting that cis people can't. And this doesn't always present itself in trans people playing trans roles. There's this very specific sound, that you can make after years and years of voice training, and cis people could do this too, but it doesn't come as naturally as it would if you were using this in everyday life, every single day, every time you woke up and went on the subway and went to work and such and such and such. Let's talk about Maddie Blaustein. First time you heard her voice was probably when she played Meowth in Pokemon, and she had that role for almost a decade. 8 years, I think is when it was. Before her death, had only come out as trans to her ex-wife before they divorced, and one of her closest friends. And she is trans. Meowth is a very masculine voice. And it's not because Maddie Blaustein didn't pass as a woman. God, I hate that word. It's because this is something that you can do as a trans actor with this kind of range. Maddie Blaustein could play masculine voices, she could play feminine voices, but she found that the most marketable way she could get jobs was to come in with a mixed demo tape and then offer to play masculine roles. Because again, when you're a trans woman, it's not like when you're on testosterone. You can still, if you keep up the practice, trans women can lose the ability to do this. But if they keep up the practice, they can reach, there's low masculine tones still. Maddie Blaustein plays a lot of masculine roles, she plays a lot of feminine roles, and you grew up hearing her voice. Did you know she was trans? Probably not. Not a lot of people did, and this is kind of the standard in voice acting. You don't know a lot about voice actors, and you don't especially know a lot about the people playing the roles in your childhood cartoons. So here's how gender works in voice acting. It doesn't really matter. Because it's a non-visual medium, the old industry standard is that it doesn't really matter who is or isn't playing the role as long as they can sound the part. I could go in, I could play a man, I could play a smoker, I could play a woman, I could play a little girl, and I can do these things, with this kind of range. And Maddie Blaustein, she played fathers in commercials, she played Meowth, she played, minor background female characters. She did all of that because she found that is a marketable skill. Because in voice acting, your gender doesn't matter.
women are often the people who play little boys in shows because men can't reach that cadence. And, labor laws, it's hard to hire little kids to do voice acting because voice acting requires very long hours that you can't demand of child actors. But you have an advantage, a bit, when you're trans and you're going into voice acting with this kind of range. I don't, because I can't act very well, but there is, the thing. Except if you're asking someone very specifically to play a trans character. Someone, especially if that character is trans within show, not just trans because you cast a trans person. When talking about casting for trans and queer characters specifically, we're talking about an industry where, in general, the idea is that because it's not a visual medium, you can cast whoever can sound right. And this is how you get things like, look at the cast of The Prince of Egypt, one of the most well-researched, well-written films of the current century. Its cast? A lot of white people are in that cast. And this is because this is an industry standard. The idea, you don't see them, it doesn't matter. And this has come up in union things over the past couple years, of course. The strike a few years ago over the visibility of casting and wanting to know what franchise you're working for. All of that, it's layers and layers of things. Right now, I want to talk specifically about queer characters, because when you make it open casting, I want to use an example. When you make it open casting for, say, a non-binary person, and you say, anyone can audition for this and we just want a specific sound. We don't care who you are. First of all, the person who told me this story called them gender-neutral people, which is not correct. When someone is non-binary, that means that they are trans, should they choose to identify. It means that they may present themselves in a certain way or they may not. Non-binary is a very large spectrum. It's not some secret third gender. It's a lot of things in a very big box that's not really a box. So when you ask someone to portray a non-binary character and you say you want a specific sound, what sound are you asking for exactly? Are you asking for an androgynous sound? Is it a feminine character? Do you want a feminine sound? Is it a masculine character? Do you want a masculine sound? Is a character that presents masculine but you want someone who was assigned female at birth? Is it someone who is assigned male at birth, but you want them to sound androgynous? What kind of sound do you want? What kind of sound do you think a non-binary person sounds like? Because I want to guarantee you, that sound doesn't exist. But when you allow cis people to audition for and be casted for these roles, and you imply that that sound exists, what kind of sounds do you think you're going to get? And better, what kind of sounds are you demanding here? Because are you asking for a sound that is accurate? Or are you asking for a sound of what you think a trans person sounds like? Are you asking for that nasally cadence? Are you asking for an androgynous sound that most people don't sound like? Are you asking for this hyper-feminized stereotype? What do you want exactly? When you say that anyone can audition for a trans role, but you don't specify that it has to be a trans actor, but you want a trans sound, what are you demanding here? And this is why I'm going to say, I understand your visual argument, that cis people shouldn't be playing trans characters, and I'm going to go a bit farther. Straight cis people shouldn't be playing queer characters at all. Because when you let a straight cis person audition for a queer role, what voice are they hearing in the back of their heads? Are they hearing the feminized voice from those 50s PSAs? Are they hearing the stereotypes from the cartoons and comedies they grew up with? When you say that a cis person can create a trans sound, what exaggerated voice stereotype are you going to demand from this person? What are they going to get away with? What are you asking for? Because I guarantee you, when you ask someone who's straight and cis to play a queer character, queerness is not what you're getting. Queerness, while it doesn't have a cadence or an accent, does have a specific sound. It does have the specific feeling behind it that a straight person cannot replicate. You cannot ask a straight person to go into your studio and create the feeling of being queer. There is years of things behind that. You cannot ask a cis person to go into your studio and create that range and find that specific comfort within the range and create that sound, because that's not something they've experienced. So that's not an accuracy you're going to get. So they're not going to sound like a trans character or a queer character. They're going to sound like the stereotype that lives inside someone's head, and that's not correct. So if visuals don't matter to you, because anything can be accurate, then if you care about accuracy, you should be asking the people who these stories are about to give their voices to these stories. Because otherwise, accuracy isn't what you're getting. You're getting a farce. You're getting, again, the stereotype that lives inside someone's head. And you're saying that that's a costume that anyone can put on, which isn't right. That is the end of my show for this week. I hope you enjoyed this special endorsed episode of me and all of my opinions, and also me and all of my facts. This is once again Queerly Yours on XLR and Land University Radio. I hope you have a good week, folks. I hope that you're having a safe time, and I hope that you're with people who care about you, and who are celebrating what you are celebrating, and who celebrate you.